Today's episode is brought to you by Girl Charlie Fabrics. Girl Charlie is your online source for knit fabrics, carrying a wide selection of unique cotton jersey, cotton lycra, brushed poly spandex, French terry, and more. Girl Charlie Fabrics also stocks all the best indie sewing patterns from designers around the world. New customers save 10% on their first order and always get a $7.99 flat shipping rate on any order of any size. So shop now at girlcharlie.com. And now here's the show. Episode 104 of the While She Naps podcast. I'm Abby Glassenberg. Today, we're talking about building an innovative company in the sewing industry with my guest, Fred Drexler. Fred, along with his wife, Joyce, founded Sulky of America, a premier thread and stabilizer company. Fred began his career in the sewing industry in 1965 at the age of 23, when he worked as a salesman for the Singer Company in Akron, Ohio. In 1969, he opened his Singer dealership in Punta Gorda, Florida, and met Joyce in 1974. She founded Speed Stitch, the company that popularized free motion embroidery using a domestic sewing machine. And in 1987, Speed Stitch partnered with a German thread manufacturer to form Sulky of America. Fred Drexler, welcome.
Well, good morning, Abby. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here and to hear about the story of your business. And you began working in the sewing industry a long time ago. So in March of 65, you were just 23 years old. How did you get a job as a Singer salesman?
Well, that's an interesting question. I had been in the Air Force shortly after high school for 4 years, and when I got out of that and got married, moved back to Akron, Ohio, and we had bought a sewing machine trying to build credit. We bought it on 90-day terms and paid that off, and I was working in another job and decided to leave that because it looked like it wasn't going anywhere. And so as I was looking for a job, the district manager for Singer called me up and wanted to talk to me about my payments on the sewing machine. And so I asked him to come to the house, and he did. And I showed him the receipts that I had. And apparently the manager of the store was not very honest and hadn't recorded those payments. So anyway, one thing led to another. And after we cleared up the business aspect of that, he said, what are you doing for a living now? And I said, well, actually, I'm looking for a job. And he said, well, I think we might have an opening for you at a local Singer store selling sewing machines. And I thought, that's the furthest thing from my mind. I can't imagine how or why I would want to sell sewing machines. But he said, well, why don't you go talk to the manager of the store? And I did, and it was a young fellow they just brought in, and I just connected with him instantly and realized that I could really learn something from this young manager. And so I thought, well, I'll do this until I find out what I really want to do with my life. And so sure enough, I started working the next week, and within 9 months, he had moved on to another store, and they had decided to close the store I was in. So that led to them asking me to manage the store until they closed it, which I did. And then they offered me another store to manage in Akron, managed that store for a year and a half, moved to Florida, and became a manager there of a store in Orlando area. And eventually, or within a very short time, they moved me to a much larger store in Gainesville, stayed there for a year and a half, and then opened my own dealership in 1969.
I see. So this really, it's funny because you figured you just do this job until you figured out what you wanted to do with your life. And it turned out this did lead to what you wanted to do with your life. So, so that's interesting. So you met your wife, Joyce, who played a significant role in the growth and development of Sulky. And you met her in 1974. I'm wondering how the two of you met.
Well, that's an interesting story as well. I think it was really on a blind date. I was in a theater company at the time, and there was four of us that had decided to start a theater company to do plays like Neil Simon comedies and that sort of thing. And we had bought a house to do the rehearsals in and to figure out our staging. So as we did that, a friend of mine came to me, and he was going through a divorce and needed a place to live. And he was a deputy sheriff who worked nights. And so we rented our house to him to live in during the day, and we used it at night to do our rehearsals. And that led to conversations about who each of us was dating. I had gone through a divorce a year prior to that. And ultimately, he led me to the girl he was dating had a best friend, and he invited her to come to one of our dress rehearsals. And that's how I met Joyce at a dress rehearsal in this small house. And ironically, we were doing a play called Norman, Is That You? And I was playing a homosexual at the time. And that was her first introduction to see me on stage doing that. So anyway.
That's funny. Okay. And it was really a good match because she was also involved in the sewing industry. So even though you were meeting outside of sewing, you were meeting, through a friend of a friend at a play, but she was really already involved in sewing. And I wondered how she got into it. She's not here to tell that part, so maybe you can tell that for her.
I will. And actually, she was not really involved in the sewing industry at all when we first met. She was working for an accountant, and she had brought her sewing machine into my store to be serviced in the first year or two that I was there. And I had no recollection of that, but she remembers that pretty vividly. But anyway, after we met and dated and eventually got married, she began to do some creative things in our store. She really designed the look of our store, and the girls that worked for us at that time that were teaching there was encouraging her to learn more about that. And she ultimately took a all-day class on doing free motion embroidery from a dealer friend of mine in a town about 80 miles away, and was pretty terrible at it to start with. But she practiced and got really, really good at it, and eventually started teaching it in our retail store. And people who loved to take her classes because of the methods that she had developed to teach them, they were all loving coming to her classes and loving to learn this creative hobby. And eventually everybody kept telling her, we'd love to learn. You show us how to do it. We do it when we're here. Then we go home and there's another picture we want to do, but we don't quite know how to hold the hoop to make wings and flowers and leaves and so forth by getting the thread to flow so it looks like a leaf. And so she developed kits that she drew patterns and drew directional arrows on those patterns so that people could see which way to turn the hoop and hold the hoop as they were making the various different elements of free motion embroidery. And eventually that led to, in the beginning, we were selling a DMC cotton thread to do this in our store back in the late 1970s. And so these kits would include, full spools of thread and the design. And ultimately, as people just really loved that whole process, we got together and figured out how to make the kits a whole lot more affordable for a national market. And so that led to us figuring out that we could put exactly the amount of thread that people needed in the kits so that they would be able to do each one of the design elements. Now, of course, black and white was always the bigger amounts, and sometimes they had full spools in there. But we had a cadre of people winding bobbins of the various different colors that we needed in the initial kits. There were full bobbins and half bobbins. So some just accent colors didn't need a full bobbin. So as she figured that whole process out, and we ultimately ended up with the first 7 kits that taught the basics of free motion, and then 6 different designs. And we made those up and sold them as black and white to start with. Ultimately, we added, instead of just giving the design to people on a paper, we started printing that design on nylon organdy, so that the consumer didn't have to figure out how to get that onto nylon organdy. That's what was going to be put into the hoop in order to be able to do the embroidery design. So we, again, started with the black and white design on the nylon organdy, put the right amount of thread in there for them to complete the project, wrote the directions for doing the whole project, and had those printed, and then did a black and white picture of what the design was going to look like in the front. And those were the early kits in 1978, 79. Then in 1980, we decided to go for full color in the printed front. And at the time we did that, then we went to New York and to talk to the Singer Company about doing this as a national thing. We wanted to sell the idea to them, do the production, do the teaching, but let them do the marketing of this, because they, certainly had dealers all over the country, and we weren't that well known around the country at that point. Singer folks really loved what we were doing, and the vice president that we talked to after he took it to the rest of the company to talk to him about it, they all loved it and said, we really see how you've been selling substantially more sewing machines because you're teaching this in your store. We want that to happen around the country, but this isn't in our 5-year plan to do this. We can't do it immediately, and we think it needs to be done. But so we'll support you, and they were a terrific support in the early days, helping to promote our first classes on this. And Joyce put together a 3-day seminar to teach teachers how to teach this in their store, and that is what really launched the company. Is the announcement by Singer to all their dealers around the country that this was available, and had their high recommendation. And
I see. So this was a kit company basically, and then a technique company that sort of helped to sell sewing machines. And so it was a wise move to go ahead and partner with Singer, since you owned a Singer dealership and were doing well selling more machines. And by the way, these were not embroidery machines, because embroidery machines didn't quite exist yet. This was just a regular sewing machine that could do a zigzag stitch that you would then, decrease and increase to create these designs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's very exactly the case. In 1980, the first embroidery machine didn't hit the market until 1993. So this was really light years ahead of that. But yeah, as a matter of fact, our very first ad said, crafty kits for 80 million neglected people. And we were talking about all the people around the country that owned a basic zigzag sewing machine and were able to learn how to do free motion embroidery by buying our kits and our books and our hoops.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said about timing here, because the late 60s, early 70s, late 70s, this was a time of real change in the home sewing industry because for a long time, sewing was economical. It was a way to save money, to make things for your family, for your household. And women were at home to do that. And everyone knew how to sew. That was part of what you knew how to do as a woman. But then we had the women's movement, things changed, women got jobs, went back to work. And that was sort of this moment when Joyce had this foresight, I think, to say, okay, the role of sewing in the home is going to change now. And it can still, as you said, 8,000 or whatever, 8 million, neglected sewing machines, that these machines can now become something different, which is a form of creativity, a form of leisure activity, something to do to be creative in your spare time and with your extra money.
And that's exactly what the thought process was and how that all developed. For me, it was an aha moment. In my career, as you said, I started in '65, and all the training for salesmen at that time was teaching you how to make a case to the woman at home of how much they were contributing to the family budget by what they sewed. By putting a dollar value on that, you could justify to the working or to the woman at home that what she was doing was contributing thousands of dollars to the family budget by doing that. And so, she deserved to have a good piece of equipment to do that on. And, and thus that was the whole sales presentation to sell them the first touch and sew sewing machines. The average male at home, his response to the female asking, the wife asking for a new sewing machine was, does the old one still work? And if it did, you don't need a new one. So we had to make a case for why they did. Well, that's where we came from. But that whole argument, that whole sales logic was fast going away as women entered the workforce. And, we found in our retail store that people would buy top model sewing machines. They'd spend $1,000, which was a lot of money in 1976 and 77, 78 in that area. They would spend $1,000 for a top model sewing machine because it had great speed control, which you really, really needed in order to do really quality free motion embroidery. And that's really what got the attention of the Singer folks, is that we were not only selling a lot of sewing machines, we were selling the very highest top model, highest price sewing machine in large numbers because of free motion embroidery and because we were selling something that people were enjoying doing. And certainly as we've moved through the years, that has, not left our thought process at all, that people do not have to do what we're doing. They don't have to buy decorative thread and do these kinds of things. And so if we wanted to attract them to our market, we had to show them it was fun, it was easy, it was fast, it was satisfying and very, something very worthy of being a hobby that they would want to do in the evenings.
I want to take a moment now to talk with our sponsor, Girl Charlie Fabrics. Here's Heather Peterson, the founder and president of Girl Charlie. And tell me a little bit about Girl Charlie. What is it all about?
Well, Girl Charlie Fabrics was started by myself a few years ago after the birth of my daughter. Kind of typical story, looking for cool clothing that I couldn't find. So I decided to teach myself how to sew and started making a small line of clothing for kids. And I really got into knit fabrics at that point. And fast forward to 2010, kind of took that passion and turned it into a business. So Girl Charlie relaunched then, selling knit fabrics exclusively online. My daughter is named Charlotte Lee. And so when she was little, we used to call her Charlie. So when we were thinking about a name for our business, actually a relative was like, why don't you call it Girl Charlie after Charlotte? So that just kind of stuck. And she's pretty proud of that now that she's 13 years old, that she's got a company named after her. We are in Long Beach, California, just south of Los Angeles.
And is LA a good spot to be located when you're in the knit fabric business?
I think so. Yeah. We've been pretty lucky about being able to work with a lot of, kind of well-known designers on their overstocks or fabrics that they don't use. So we get quite a few unique types of knits that you can't really get anywhere else. So that's a real bonus to being in this area. And also, just being such a large port area, we get a lot of access to, fabrics coming in from around the world as well. Working with us, Girl Charlie, we're not just a big fabric machine. We try to make it so, we give our customers as much support as they're giving to us. We are online at www.girlcharlie.com.
And Charlie is spelled
Charlee.
Thank you so much, Heather. And now back to my conversation with Fred. I'll just jump forward for one quick second to the recent collaboration with Cotton+Steel, which is this selection of Cotton+Steel branded Sulky thread that's really beautifully, spooled even. So each spool has a different sticker and is a different color, the spool itself, and then the thread on it, sort of contrasts. And anyway, it's just, and it comes on its own display, and there's a beautiful video narrated by Melody Miller, who's the creative director of Cotton+Steel, showing how this thread was made. And it just, I thought of it because, as you're saying, this is a leisure activity. This is something you're going to do because it brings you satisfaction, feeling of creativity, and that sort of thing. And in that way, this particular collaboration is really collectible, really tactile, visually beautiful, whether you actually use that thread or not.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And, we're just delighted to be partnering with Cotton+Steel because they are just tremendously creative and innovative in every way. And they certainly have led us down a very beautiful path to where we have created this magnificent display and 100 gorgeous colors and just super high quality thread. Everything about this is just says fun and buy me and collect me. And so that's been a very good association.
Fun, right. Fun and buy me and collect me. And I think that that notion, right, sort of rings true throughout all of these decades, even back to when Joyce was coming up with all of this. And education really has been at the heart of what you have done. In other words, being able to teach teachers, teach customers through kits, and then later through books. And Joyce has written a lot of books. One of her first books, maybe it was her first one in 1981, Thread Painting. And I think maybe she sort of coined that term. Is that right?
Yes, that's very exactly what happened. We wanted to, or she did. I keep taking the credit for all these things, but let's be clear about this. My role through the years has been administrative. I'm the go to the bank and finance the business guy. I'm the hire people and train them and organize the business aspects of it. And Joyce is totally the creative end of our business. Anything and everything that's creative about our business has been all Joyce. And
but that balance and partnership. I mean, that balance and partnership is really a necessary and ideal, and two people are going to run a business together. So
exactly, certainly. I don't want to step on her toes in any way, and when it comes to creativity, and for those starting a new business in partnership with your mate, at some point in this conversation, if you want to hear how that went, I'll go ahead and share that.
Well, why don't we go there now? So, I mean, I think that there are quite a few people out there who are doing just that, where maybe one of them started with the creative business while the other kept a day job. And then over time, it just made sense, given the complementary skill set and financial situation, for them to work together. I can think of many couples actually who are doing just that. And so tell us a little bit about the highs and lows, or the ups and downs of that kind of relationship.
Okay, well, certainly any partnership involving two sides, and we have the partnership of Joyce and I in the speed stitch business, and then the partnership with the German company, and to create Sulky of America. So I'm very, very cognizant of what happens in partnerships and what needs to happen and how frail they can be if not clearly defined at the outset. But our partnership, our evolution in 1976, I had a really nice retail store in a new mall and was doing some really great business. And I opened a second store in a town about 30 miles away in 1979. And then about that same time, we had the Joyce creating these kits, and I was trying to figure out how to make a business out of that. So, she pretty much ran things in the first year or so of doing that. And as we did the trip to Singer, and they decided to help us, and we started working out of our house, creating kits in the bedroom and living room, and eventually using our garage to do the shipping and people starting to come to work at our house every day. The company in its early stages, had some decent growth, and Joyce wanted to add certainly new products, and it was up to me to figure out how we were going to finance all that. And so the first year or two of doing Speed Stitch, she was doing a lot of traveling. Actually, the first 5 years, she did an enormous amount of traveling around the country to teach her 3-day programs. And so I, was left to do the selling of those programs, to talk to people around the country to get them to sign up, and all of the organizational aspects of that. So, she, in the early stages, I was running 2 stores. She was running this business. And there became this clash, if you will, around 1982 or so, as we were a couple of years into it. And the thing to understand about growing a business is that there's 2 ways that you can finance a growing business, and one is out of profits, and the other is out of your own money or financing. And that was really becoming an issue in that we were using a tremendous amount of the monies coming from my retail operations to finance this business, and at some point it became clear that, to me anyway, that we needed to have a long-term business plan to figure out what we thought growth was going to be and how we were going to finance it all. And that became the time to involve going to the bank and borrowing money against our house and our life insurance policies and anything and everything we could do to get money to finance the growth that we were experiencing.
And how long did you hang on to the retail store? Did you keep that for a long time after that?
I really did. Actually, I ended up selling the one store that I had in the adjoining town in 1983. I sold that store so that I could focus more of my energies on the growing Speed Stitch business. But by that time, my son, Eric, who's been around our business since the late 1970s, he was working in our store, and he became the manager of the store. So we ended up keeping that business until 1996. So it was a long-term proposition for us to be in retail, and certainly a lot of what we learned about what consumers wanted, we learned in our retail stores. So that just became the point when we got to 1996. Our 20-year lease was up, and by that time we'd already been 9 years into Sulky of America, and just no longer had the time to even think about what was going on in retail. So we ended up selling that second store.
Okay, I see. So Right. Okay. I actually want to sort of go through the story of becoming Sulky of America, because I think for people to totally understand how this business grew, we need to sort of trace that. So in 1983, Joyce is getting ready to create these speed stitch kits, and you both together traveled to a big trade show called the Bobbin Show. I don't know if that show's still going on or not. I did not look into that.
Yeah, no, it's not.
It's not. Okay. But this was a huge embroidery trade show. And the two of you traveled together. She saw a booth there, a brand new exhibitor in a small booth that was there for the first time from Germany called Gunold. And she caught sight of something in that booth that made her super excited. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that experience of being at the Bobbin Show?
Yeah, sure. That's, the show was enormous. It wasn't just for embroidery, commercial embroidery. It was for every imaginable thing that you would use to make a three-piece suit or to make any kind of clothing. So there was I could take 15 minutes to describe all the various different things that were there. But anyway, the company that we saw there, they were well known in the embroidery industry because of their artistic work. They would do what it was called punch needle punching designs, so that commercial embroiderers could send them a picture of anything, and their artist would convert that into a punch tape that would run through a commercial embroidery machine and create that design with the needle just going straight up and down, and with the hoop moving it. So the punch needle, punch tape would direct the machine as far as the hoop movements that were needed. People would send their designs to Germany to have their artists punch them. And at some point, Gunold decided that they would come over and provide that service directly, so people didn't have to wait for designs to be shipped back and forth. There wasn't all the technology we have today to be able to send that by computer. So Gunold was having their very first show in a single 10 by 10 booth, and Joyce saw that they had this product called Solvy. And that was really the very first time that anybody on U.S. soil knew anything about a water-soluble stabilizer, was the Solvy that they brought to the industrial market. Joyce was extremely excited, because at that point of seeing the Solvy, she was flashing back to what was being used at that time to do cut work or any kind of open work, stitching across open areas. You would use the plastic film that the dry cleaners would cover your clothes with when you pick them up. And picking out all those little pieces after that was done was just a very tedious job.
Oh my gosh. So you would literally, that I'm thinking of that, like, it's like a thin plastic bag, really, that wraps your dry cleaning. So you would take that and you would lay it over the area, and then you would stitch, because there was no fabric below. The stitches were going to be the fabric, basically. And then afterward, you would go in there with like a little scissors or a pin or something and pick out the little bits of plastic.
Yeah, that's how it was done.
Wow. So that was not a great solution. And so she saw this water-soluble stabilizer called Solvy. There was nothing like this on the market, but essentially what it would do is, after you would stitch over it, you would soak it, and then the stabilizer would disappear, leaving just the thread work in place.
That's exactly how it worked, and worked extremely well. And so she was so excited about that, and we immediately placed an order with them for some, just to take it home and try it. And once she tried it, we got together with them and said, we'd like to buy this in large quantities and market it under our own name. So the initial name for this in the U.S. market was called Washaway. And we had that trademark name, and sold that product almost immediately to a dozen different distributors and a couple of different chain stores. And just really, that really launched our company into the arena where people that distributed products, those, most, I don't know if a lot of people understand, but our company sells to distributors who sell to stores, who sell to consumers. And so when I talk about a distributor, that's really what I'm talking about, is someone who would sell to a retail store who would then sell to the consumers. So we were able to attract a lot of attention to our company by selling this product. And initially, some of those distributors wanted to sell our speed stitch kits too, but we didn't really understand the distribution system in terms of what pricing they needed in order to be able to make a profit when they sold to a store who sold to the consumer. So we never really did have a very good plan in place to understand how to sell to distributors, how to get a wider distribution of our product. But indeed, when we were able to find the distributors, or they found us and wanted to buy that product, that made it our entry in as Sulky of America to be able to sell to distributors, that we had an introduction to that market through that whole process.
So it's interesting, like your kits, although that's where this all started, they were like surpassed because you discovered this domestic consumer application for what was then kind of an industrial product, brought it to a new market, which was in the United States, that was just taking off. And then that product became the most popular product. And because you were maybe able to price it in such a way that selling to a distributor, which is, like 30% below wholesale, was still affordable. So it worked better than a kit, which really needs to be hand assembled. And there's a lot of sort of bits and pieces that go into a kit that if you're not pricing for distribution from the outset, you might price it too low. And then when you do go to a distributor, realize there's no profit in this.
Right. You couldn't, they couldn't sell it to the same market that you were trying to sell it to create a bigger market. Because there was no pricing in there for them. They couldn't compete with the price you were selling it for.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. So this became really popular, this Solvy product. And then next came thread. And I think most people, I guess people today see both Solvy and Sulky as two things that make up your company. But maybe they think thread first. I'm not sure, but that's possible. So thread came next, and it sounded like you had been sourcing some thread already from India, but it wasn't super high quality, or sourcing it wasn't super dependable. And then the Viking company came to you in 1985 and asked if you had thread or could source the right kind of thread for their new embroidery machine.
That's really what happened. And the Sue Houseman really came to us with a spool of thread that one of their educators had found in Europe, and it was a spool of Sulky thread. And they were going to be coming out in 1985. It wasn't an embroidery machine yet, but it was doing embroidery-like designs with the decorative stitches on a sewing machine. So in 1985, they brought out a machine that had a feature they called pictogram, which really was making pictures using decorative stitches, not free motion or not doing embroidery-like things, but still picture-like things. And they were looking for a very high-quality thread to do this. And when they brought that spool to us, from the 1983 until 1985, Gnold kept seeing how much product we were selling of their Solvy, and they kept saying, why don't you sell our decorative thread? And it's like, well, we just invested in this other line of thread and have invested time and effort and money to market it. And so we weren't real keen on doing another line of thread at that point, until Viking came to us and said, do you know where we can get this? And I immediately went to Chris Gnold and I said, look, send some samples to Viking. If they like it, can you work out pricing to me so that I can sell it to them as a distributor who can sell it to the end user, or actually to the store owner and then to the end user. And at the same time, I asked Viking, I said, look, if you like this thread, would you distribute it? Would you be the ones who sell it to your dealers? And, they said, well, sure, that just would make perfect sense for us to do that. And so that is really what happened. They loved the thread. They became the first distributors of Sulky thread and sold it to all of their hundreds of dealers. And we had at that very first spool of thread, at that time, we only had the industrial size to be able to sell. And that was a 1,050-yard spool, which had not wooden, but a cardboard core, and which stuck out on both ends. And that was the way, they sold that smaller version of their 5,000 meter cone on a 1,000-meter spool. So we began to sell that. We created some acrylic displays to put 30 colors in, 3 spools each of 30 colors, and that's how we began selling it to Viking stores and ultimately in Cloth World and to other stores in other dealerships around the country.
So the first issue here was that the thread that Gunnold had was really wound on really big spools, like spools that were maybe meant for more of an industrial application. And in order for it to be affordable for consumers and sort of realistic for what a consumer, just shopping at their local store would want, it needed to be on a smaller sized spool at a lower price. And so that was one thing that Gunnold had to do, was to get different equipment to make that happen. But what about this thread was different than the other? There was thread in the market. So why was this something that Viking was like, hey, this is what we really need? I mean, was it different in some way?
Well, I think the obviously difference was the quality. I mean, this is the highest quality thread made from the highest quality raw goods available in the world. And it was then and it is now, and it's the same manufacturing process with the same raw goods. So quality was really number one for them. And in the early days, that first spool of thread sold for $5, which was a lot of money for a spool of thread in 1985. And the process of getting from 1985 to 1987, when we did a partnership. Is this a good time to talk about that? Or
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So we sort of touched on this idea of financing, and you were talking about whether, you can finance by basically taking the profit of the business and putting it back into the business, investing it back, or you can go, use your own money or borrow money from the bank. And so you were in charge of figuring that out all along. And in order to start importing and selling thread now, in addition to selling Sulky, you needed financing. And so how did you work out how to partner with them to make that happen? Because that's a pretty significant business move.
Well, it was for both of us. And it really, once we started selling a large amount of the 1,050-yard spool, Joyce, and I both said, look, if we could get this on a smaller spool and bring that price down, I think we could really explode this market. And so, our discussions with Gunnold were based on that. Every time we talked to them over the next year, that was the conversation. And so finally, one day, Chris came to me and said, look, if you in order to do this whole process, in order to do a smaller spool, we're going to have to buy all new equipment to be able to wind that. And so, how many spools do you think you could sell? And so we can get a concept here of how this whole thing would work. And so, I put together a business plan, which I highly encourage for any new business starting up, is to put together a business plan, go to your bank, go to your small business association or community colleges, anywhere, to learn how to put together a really solid business plan. So anyway, by that time, I had learned how to do that. I put together a business plan on what I thought we could sell, how we would market it, and the whole every aspect of the financing. I took that to my bank, and I said, "Look, here's what I think we can do, and here's how I think we can grow this business." And if the partners, or not the partners at that point, but if our manufacturer is willing to buy the equipment, here's what I think we can do. Well, the bank assured me that we didn't have enough capital or the wherewithal to be able to finance that sort of operation. And when I took it to Chris Ganold, he looked at all of that and said, I'm going to have to invest, a couple $100,000 in new equipment here, and I'm going to have one customer to sell this to, and that's you. And so at that point, both of us sort of said, well, why don't we do this together? Why don't we see if we can put together a partnership where we apply our expertise. We knew the marketplace after being in the international marketplace for 7 years. We understood how to market to that home sewing crafting customer, and they knew how to do the manufacturing, and we're doing it extremely well. But their U.S. offices in Atlanta or Marietta, Georgia at that time, they had a nice sized warehouse, and they had all the facilities to be able to do the shipping, the accounting, and everything having to do with that aspect of the business. So the partnership developed. We both brought things that we wanted the understandings to be in the partnership, and how everything would go, buy-sell agreements, what to do in the event of disagreements, just every aspect of a business. We studied all of that, and we brought solutions to all of those things, so that answered every what if.
Right.
Before we started the partnership.
It's kind of like writing a will, where you need to think through all of these scenarios that you don't want to have happen. But if they did happen, and things where, one partner needed or wanted to leave, there was a disagreement that couldn't be resolved, all of those things, but you have to lay those out in advance. It's also, with the finances, who's going to contribute what, when, and for how long, and all of that, so that you can make sure that you're starting with perfectly clear communication.
Right, exactly. And you talked about financing, and in the early years, we really the two sides financed Sulky of America for the first several years before we really got banks involved. And that was, done by virtue of they had an operation that they were selling their products and their services to the industrial market. We had Speed Stitch that was selling to our side of the business, and so both companies were profitable, and they were using some of their profits to finance the growth of Sulky of America. And indeed, it was a true partnership in that nobody took any salary out of this. And the only thing that we ever did was do profit distributions, and we would decide at our annual meetings whether any, how much or if any profits were going to be distributed, because, we started with a very small amount of money that each partner put into this, and pretty much just let it ride for the first probably 6 or 7 years before there was any profit distribution.
Right. And I think that's also important for people to hear, because I think there's sometimes an expectation that things are going to be successful right away. And what success means is that there's profits right away. And that is not always the case, or often the case.
Well, that's true. And a lot of times, new businesses will, I'll get to talk to them in the booths that I still do at trade shows. And, they'll ask for my advice on different things. And, the first thing that I want them to do is a business plan, like I mentioned earlier, but and a path on how they're going to finance things, and gauge their own commitment to this. Are they fully committed? Are you willing to do a second mortgage on your house? Are you willing to cash in your IRAs and whole life insurance policies, borrow against those? We had to do all those things. and worked for several years without taking any money out of the speed stitch business. We did the first 3 years of that business with a commitment that we wouldn't take a nickel out of it, and we didn't. And then we pretty much worked each of us for minimum wage for the next several years after that. But, you look at the growth of the business and you see where that money went. It's in here in inventory, it's in receivables, it's in.
And to be clear, you had people working for you and you were paying them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So they were basically, your employees were earning more than you were.
Well, when you own a business, if you run it properly, everybody gets paid and then you get what's left over.
Right.
And that's your incentive to make profit, for sure.
Right. I mean, I think investing in people is sometimes the biggest investment.
Well, it is. And that's certainly been the case for us through the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I wanted to touch on, so things began to grow. You've got thread and you've got a whole suite now of different stabilizers, not just that first Sulky, but there's all different iterations of it. And I think that there was one that was actually really interesting and maybe sort of unexpected. So Sulky sticky fabric Sulky, which I have used many times, but is now being marketed under different names. And one of those names is Sulky Stick and Carve, which is for use carving pumpkins, transferring designs to pumpkin carving. And a chef came to you with this idea. So could you tell us how that happened?
Well, that was, when we first brought out the fabric Sulky, it's a water soluble stabilizer that has more of a fabric feel and touch to it than as opposed to Sulkys, which are a film. So there's greater flexibility. There's greater strength in being able to sew larger amounts of thread across it. So anyway, we brought out the fabric Sulky, and then we were able to figure out how to put a sticky back on it that would also dissolve when you got it wet. And so the natural inclination for us is, because people knew about fabric Sulky, we wanted the brand name was Sticky Fabric Sulky when we put a sticky back on it with a release sheet. So after several years of selling Sticky Fabric Sulky, I got a phone call or email, I guess, from a guy in California who was a chef and also did various different fruit carvings for occasions. He carved watermelons was the thing he was doing the most, and he was just raving about Sticky Fabric Sulky for doing watermelons, because the hardest part of the process, if you're not super artistic to start with, to create your own design, is to have a design that you can put in place that you can cut out. And so he had tested and tried numerous other products and just found this to be the absolutely perfect thing to do that, to do his watermelon carving. So we did some extensive testing of our own and found that the most difficult part of carving a pumpkin for the beginner, or for anybody really, again, is to get that design on a round surface. And we were looking at how people were doing that and are still doing it today. People that don't know about stick and carve, they're taking a flat design and somehow taping it onto their pumpkin, and then tapping holes around the design so that when they pull that away, they would have the little holes to carve from one point to another.
Yeah, I've done it that way.
Yeah, I know. And that's the hardest part of the whole process.
Yeah.
A flat design on a round surface. And so the stick and carve, you can get a design off the internet. There's numerous designs that you can buy, and you can download and put a 8.5 by 11 sheet of stick and carve in your copier or your printer, and print that design right on there, peel the release sheet off, throw that away, and just simply stick it in place and pat it down, and it adheres right to that dry pumpkin. And you can then proceed to carve every aspect of that. And when you're done, you can just take a wet towel and wipe across that, and it's totally gone. It's just that easy.
And so instead of sort of saying, oh gosh, what a weird use of our product, that's not what it's for. We are this sort of, purist company that's only using these products for, fine embroidery or for, beautiful stitching, heirloom, stitching or something like that. Instead, you said, okay, here is actually a really good use for this in a different market, a Halloween market. And we're going to get a new name for this product, for this market, and go for it.
Exactly. And, the people can use that product year round because you can carve gourds and cantaloupe and, every imaginable kind of thing. Woodworkers can use it. There's just any number of different places in other crafts that you need a design in place to do something over the top of. And this is perfect for that. But
yeah, I think it's kind of neat to be nimble enough to be and sort of not so pure. So, sort of stuck up or something like that, but to be able to say, okay, here's a new way. And let's follow what people are doing, real people are doing and sort of listen to them and be flexible. And I think that's really admirable. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the next generation at Sulky. You mentioned your son, Eric, who is he's still a national educator. Is that right?
Yes, he is. Mm-hmm.
And so he's still working in the business, but you passed on the role of president in 2009 to Jason Prater, who was just 35 at that time. And I wondered how, although he'd been working since 1995 for the company, so I wondered how you and Joyce met Jason and sort of how he sort of rose up through these ranks.
Yeah, I'd be glad to share that. And incidentally, before we move away from Eric is a tremendously creative person. And, he's really known as the master of free motion embroidery. He does beautiful, beautiful works of art with a straight stitch embroidery aspect to what he does rather than a zigzag embroidery. And he has online classes. He just taped a series of classes in Denver last week through Craft University, the F&W company.
Oh, yeah.
That will be available, I think, in August. But this is the second of his courses. He does a basic free motion, and then this is the intermediate. Or for those that already know the basics, they can pick up from there. But Eric's desire in life is not to be the administrator, to do he's more of a Joyce type person who loves the creativity, he loves to teach, he loves to entertain, and he's fabulous at doing that. So, his role in the company, he started repairing sewing machines in our retail store when he was 16 so he could get money to run his car, which is pretty important for a 16-year-old. And he's been in the business through the years and done every imaginable aspect of it to today when he's 51. So he's a real treasure. But anyway, Jason's story is that he came to us as a 21-year-old. His stepmother was working for the partners, Ganold, he got married in Louisiana, moved to Atlanta, and she got him a job in the warehouse for working for Ganold, and he did that for the first year or so, gradually moving up. His work ethic and his mind works in such ways that he's always looking for better ways of doing things and ways to save money. And, that's not lost on a business owner who's got somebody who's chomping at the bit to help them save money and to get the job done better and faster. So, within a very short time, he was, Ganold promoted him to customer service. And he did really super well there. He moved into inventory management. About that time, he also started doing the inventory management for Sulky. My partner and I worked encouraging him to get a further education. He just had a high school education at that point. So Gnold actually ended up paying for his 4 years of college. He went to Kennesaw State University for 4 years, worked full time, graduated with a 4.0, and we knew we really, really had something that a person that had the drive and ambition to really get ahead. And so once he got done with college, we brought him into the sales side of Sulky. He ended up working in that side by side with me in that aspect. Made him a vice president early on, and in 2004, I told him that if he was interested, I would put him on a 5-year path to run the company, and would mentor him through those 5 years. And basically, we followed that path. Virtually every decision, everything that was going forward with our business, he was involved in the whole thinking it through process, and it became, the question was, well, Jason, what would you do? That was always my question to him all through those 5 years, and I found that 99.5% of the time he was thinking exactly on the path that I was on, and so I really felt very confident when I turned the reins over to him in 2009 that he could run the company, and he's just done a tremendous job ever since then.
Wow, that's a really fascinating story. He's literally worked in every single aspect, it sounds like, and had such wonderful mentorship from you all along, and from the company putting him through college. And that's really an inspiring story. And in the end, as you and Joyce retire, I know you're still involved in the company, but not in sort of that role. Is this something that you end up selling, or is this something that you sort of, how does that work? I just don't know how that works. Sort of, what would you do at this point?
And that's always something that's on our mind. Joyce decided 2 years ago to fully retire. She really just got to the point at age 65 that she really just didn't want to have to produce things on a deadline any longer, and so she's been fully retired for 2 years now. I stepped back 10% a year from 2009 for the next 4 years, and I've kind of stayed at the 60% level, if that's something you could quantify. I work actively and vigorously to keep in good shape and to keep my mind active. And I thoroughly enjoy every aspect of this business. I wouldn't enjoy doing the day-to-day operation anymore, as having been away from that for 8 years. But I enjoy my participation in the company, and expect to continue to do that as long as I'm physically able. In terms of selling a business, that's always a challenge when you have a partnership, and certainly that's something you want to consider if you get into a partnership is, how can we get out of this? How can we get our money out of it at some point?
Right.
And basically, selling 50% of a business is a challenge. Quite frankly, we've talked to a number of people through the years that wanted to buy our part of the business, but when they saw the structure of the business and that it is a 50-50 partnership, and basically that means neither party has control. So everybody has to agree or nothing can change, and that's really the reality of a 50-50 partnership. While we did incorporate the business, moved away from the joint venture partnership structure. We moved away from that in 2001 and incorporated so that at that point we could have a president. We could hire a president anytime that a president needed to be hired to run the business. It wouldn't have to be the president of Gnold and the president of Speed Stitch were the two managing partners. And so if one of them withdrew or died or retired, then, if that was the case with Gnold, and it is what happened really, is that the guy that I had worked with, Ole Pryor, for years and years, was going to retire. And the next president of Gnold had no idea of all the things that we had gone through to get to where we were. And so it just became more logical as we all got older to have a corporation that had a president, and that company would then pay all of its employees rather than dispersing profit, where each of the two companies would then go from there. So, the short answer to your question is that it's at some point, we would like to be able to sell our share of the business. Just from the standpoint of at the time that you pass away, it's easier to pass cash on to your next of kin rather than passing on half of a business,
which they then may have to sell. They then may be stuck in a situation of having to sort it out. And so so it does make it simpler, but I can see the complexity there in forming with this partnership. So that's really a fascinating case study about being able to pass this on. So okay, so I wanted to just make sure we talked a little bit about sort of your recommendations, which really have to do with some of your lifestyle choices about how you and Joyce are spending your time these days. You have 4 children between you and 6 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. That's wonderful.
Yes, it is.
My goodness, yeah. And you are an avid motorcyclist.
I have been, and still are. We actually, when I first met Joyce back in 1974, I had a 2-wheel motorcycle at that point, and we enjoyed some trips together on that, and kept a 2-wheel motorcycle until 1986, and she always enjoyed that as well as I. When we started the Sulky business in 1987, I knew that the traveling was going to be very intense. I planned to do 20 to 24 trade shows a year, plus calling on other major clients, and so I traveled very extensively. So sold the motorcycle and didn't get another one until 2004. And by that time, we had a second home in North Carolina, in the mountains of North Carolina, and we wanted to get a motorcycle, and couldn't find any place where we could store that, because our house was up a long gravel road, curvy gravel road, and I didn't want to have to go up and down that on 2 wheels. So anyway, ultimately, one of our friends got a 3-wheel, a trike is what they call it. Front, everything looks, you essentially buy a brand new, Honda Goldwing, and you chop off the back and you put a trike conversion on it. So it's got 2 wheels in the back. So that is what we bought in 2004, really at Joyce's urging. And in 2005, we took our first really long motorcycle trip. It was a little over 5,000 miles with 2 friends of ours, 2 couples. Each of them had trikes. So we did a 3.5-week trip out through Colorado and Utah and that area of the world. And I just fell in love with that. And so once we were able to get into this semi-retirement stage where I could take longer periods of time off, that 3.5 weeks was the longest I'd ever been off. If I got a week off anywhere, it was really something.
Right.
So anyway, I always thought I wanted to, take 6 months off and ride all over the country on a motorcycle. That was my thought when I was 50, but the reality in 2012 we did our very longest ride. That was and just Joyce and I did that, and we were gone for 46 days, and we did just a shade over 10,000 miles.
Wow.
we were in and out of every one of the major national parks in the country. And, we were all the way out around Puget Sound in Seattle and came down the West Coast, Pacific coast, all the way down almost to San Francisco. And again, in and out of all the national parks. So that was just a fabulous trip, and pulled a trailer and had all of the things we needed in there. I had my golf clubs and our clothes, and for various different temperatures. It got down below freezing a few times in some of those parks out there in September. And so we had lots of different layers of clothes to put on. And so I'm kind of, got hooked on that. We did another ride in 2014 that was a little over 8,000 miles, and we did out through Western Canada, through Banff and Jasper National Park and those areas. Fabulous scenery. So that's we're not as inclined, I think, to do super long trips. I just drove to Ohio 3 weeks ago for a family reunion. That was about 1,400 miles altogether, but we do love it. We're in the mountains in North Carolina, so our day rides here for 100, 120 miles, and lots of curvy roads and beautiful scenery, and that's kind of what we're hooked on.
That's wonderful. It sounds really fun and adventurous way to spend some of your retirement years. So, Fred, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the While She Naps podcast. I so enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I enjoyed being with you today, Abby.
Thank you. And you've been listening to the While She Naps podcast. I'm Abby Glassenberg. Visit my blog, whileshenaps.com, where you can sign up for my email newsletter to get the best in sewing, blogging, and small business delivered right to your inbox each week. Today's episode was brought to you by Girl Charlie Fabrics. If you are on the hunt for one-of-a-kind knit fabrics and indie sewing patterns, look no further than girlcharlie.com. Girl Charlie Fabrics stocks a wide range of florals, novelties, solids, stripes, and more. And they're all shipping for the low price of only $7.99. So find your perfect fabrics and patterns to satisfy your sewing needs at girlcharlie.com. Thank you so much, Girl Charlie. And if you enjoyed this show, tell a friend about it. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.